I'm Metta Spencer, and today we are going to the Caucasus, and we are going to Ukraine. Or at least we're going to talk about Ukraine, because this is the terrible day that we've all been more or less expecting for the last several weeks or months. And that is that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and there's a war definitely ongoing right now. People have already been killed, tanks are in the streets, and bombings are taking place. So our plan for the day has been related to this because we were expecting trouble, and it's time for peace activists, I think, to look at things that have gone wrong, because this is a failure for us. If we as peace activists make it our business to try to prevent wars, we have failed. And we may look at what we might have done better, or what the world should have done if they'd paid attention to us, and what we should have been telling the world to do. So all of these retrospective regrets are appropriate now, although not exactly appropriate, because it's such a hot crisis, an urgent emotional event going on right as we speak, that taking a larger view is a bit of a challenge. But we do have some people with us today who can take a larger view, who have looked at the possibility of establishing, or the methods of even establishing, local zones of peace, even possibly during moments of bloodshed. Dr. Christopher Mitchell is George Mason University professor. I think he may be a retired professor, and the co-author of a book called Local Peace Building and Legitimacy: Interactions Between National and Local Levels. This, I believe, has to do with the notion of local zones of peace. And he is, I believe, in near Washington, D.C. At least that's where George Mason is located. In Tbilisi, we have Irakli Kakabadze, who is a well-known Georgian poet and dramatist, and he has been founding and is now directing a Gandhian institution in Tbilisi. And in also, I presume, in Tbilisi is Professor Irakli Kakabadze, who is the director of the School of Conflict Analysis and Management at Tbilisi State University. We are also joined here in Toronto by Lynn Adamson, who's a well-known Canadian peace activist. Because of the urgency and the drama going on today, I don't think that we can start off with a very philosophical analysis, but we have to spend some moments actually considering what is going on right now, and then quickly turn our attention. And I would like Chris Mitchell to take the lead.
Thank you very much. As anybody who has been interested in peace and trying to produce peace, it's a bad day. I think probably you're right. We have failed, but then so have very many other people who could hardly be regarded as being peace activists. I think the only thing that, first, all right, point number one, I don't think there's very much we can do at the present moment. The shooting war has started. That's always a very bad time for people to be asked, well, you're peace activists, what can you do now? Because it seems to me that at least, well, when the shooting started, or immediately after the shooting has started, there isn't much anybody can do, particularly those of us who are not in any kind of position of to influence events. I think what we can do, and partly this is because I'm an academic and my ideas are really about producing ideas, producing useful ideas, is to start thinking ahead and ask ourselves, what might we be able to do once one of these famous off-ramps has been found and things have calmed down, and we, I think, need to speculate about where we might be when that happens and what we could do depending upon what the situation is when we get to the end of the off-ramp. It seems to me that there are two ways to think about this. The first one is to take up the idea that this is part of a long drawn-out Moscow-based strategy for doing something about restoring Russia's place in the world as it was under the Soviet Empire. And if one takes that particular line of thought, then there is the question about what can anybody do to restore some kind of security equilibrium in Eastern Europe. The second place you could start from, and this is where I'd like to start from, if that's okay, is let's suppose that there are limited objectives to what Moscow is doing. That it's not an attempt to restore, Stalinist, the Stalinist Soviet Union, but that it is an attempt to produce some kind of sense of security for Moscow. And if that's the case, are we going to see in a couple of weeks' time a situation where the Russian military has taken over a chunk of the Ukraine? I'm sorry, this sounds awfully cold-blooded, but I'm trying to think objectively about this, and is willing to stop there. And then we have to start thinking about what kind of a peaceful region we might envisage and work towards. What we have been doing at George Mason University is mainly focusing on what local communities can do to survive in the middle of a civil war. So one of the things that they can do, and many of them try to do, is to establish a sort of a neutral area, an unarmed area, a non-threatening area to the combatants around their town or their village or their vereda or their municipality. As you can tell, most of the things we've looked at have been in places like the Philippines or Colombia. As Irakli remembers, where all of this started, oddly enough, was in Armenia, when we were visiting a town up near the border with Azerbaijan. And one of the local officials, a very formidable lady, said, what we're trying to do is establish a peace corridor along the what had become an international border. I mean, previously it had been a border between two Soviet provinces. So there are a variety of sorts of peace zones. You can have a peace zone or a peace community, which is characterized by not having any weapons in it, not allowing combatants in there except without weapons, where there are various ways in which they can conduct themselves. And that's one kind of peace zone. Other kinds of peace zones are neutral corridors, buffer zones, etc., etc. What I tried to do a couple of days ago, actually it's a week ago now, was I wrote a letter to the Financial Times. And what I suggested in the letter was that one way of thinking about this problem after one had achieved an off-ramp is to think about what happened with regard to Austria in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Now, Austria is informally neutral, It is not exactly disarmed. I mean, there is an Austrian army, but it's not permitted to operate outside of the boundaries of Austria, except as part of a peacekeeping force. So, in other words, Austria has a certain amount of what I guess you could refer to as limited sovereignty. It's not permitted to do certain things. It is, however, a member of a large number of European organizations, economic, cultural, etc., etc. It's not a member of NATO, but it has a status which has been recognized since, I'm trying to remember the date of the Austrian treaty, but my memory goes. But it was a deal that was worked out between the Allies and the Austrians several years after the ending of the Second World War, when people were asking, well, what are we going to do with Germany long term, and what are we going to do with Austria long term?
Excuse me, I could add a little bit about that, because I did have a conversation with Pavel Palaschenko, who is Gorbachev's interpreter, and I asked him how Austria had come about, which I didn't really know, and he attributed a lot of it to the Soviet leaders, who at that time believed that it would be inconvenient or difficult to hold bases and alliance in Austria, and were almost, I don't know whether they were the leaders in doing this, but they were quite engaged with and eager to see Austria become a neutral country, and they facilitated or actually took the lead in that, which is a very wonderful thought. We'd like to see it happen again, but I was surprised to hear him say that. Although he was not sanguine about the possibility of being able to do that with the Ukraine today at all. I think we ought to, get really right behind that idea, because it sounds to me like the best possibility going. Please, I interrupted you, but go on with your description of Austria, and also maybe some of the other countries. How does the zone of peace compare to the whole notion of simply declaring neutrality, and what are the obligations of a neutral state if it could be achieved?
Well, I think the first thing to say about Austria, of course, is that it's a long way away from Russia. It may not look that way on a map, but it is, if you think about it. So it was a relatively easy thing in a situation in the immediate post-war era, to think that it was in the interests of the then Soviet Union to have it neutralized. I mean, if you think about the whole of Eastern Europe at that particular point of time, it was under the control of the Red Army in 1945. The countries that were in that particular part of the world, very, very quickly became sort of satellites. So there was this sort of area of safety for the Soviet Union. I mean, they've been trying to construct that since 1939, 1940. They tried to take over a chunk of Finland in 1939. They shifted the borders of Poland westward, and hence the borders of the Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, westward as well. So that's a very different situation that you've got at the moment, which is the boundaries of NATO. And let's remember that NATO was originally established in order to deal with the Soviet Union. I mean, I don't know if you remember this saying, but if somebody asked the question, well, what's NATO for? Well, it's for three things. It's to keep the Americans in, to keep the Russians out, and to keep the Germans down. And that was the origin of NATO. Well, what you've got now is the NATO alliance has been gradually, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's gradually been moving eastward and eastward and eastward. And what they're trying to do, and I'm sure Irakli and Guguli have views on this because it's the same thing that they're doing with Georgia, is to prevent NATO coming right up to the borders of Russia. So if you look at it from Moscow's point of view, you've also actually seen several attempts by Russia after the ending of the Soviet Union to become more fully engaged in Europe. And every time they've tried to do this, it's come to nothing. And so one of the things I think we have to bear some responsibility for is the rejection of the Soviet attempt to become integrated in Europe, for good and sufficient reasons. I mean, the whole thing is a tragedy. How do you actually arrange a new security system, if we want to call it that, which at the same time guarantees the Ukrainians, or maybe what's left of it, a certain level of freedom, sovereignty, etc., to get on and do their own thing, whatever it is, at the same time as you don't actually put together what the people in Moscow, whether it's Putin or anybody else, would see as a long-term threat. That's the dilemma. It seems to me that if one thinks about this as a dilemma, then one can think rather fruitfully about, if we can dampen down what's going on at the moment, let's think about alternatives to a situation where you've got NATO here, you've got the Soviets there, and sooner or later somebody is going to start some stuff again. So that's where I'm at.
I think that one of the reasons for having Irakli and Guguli here is because it's not just a fear in Ukraine today, but there is every reason to worry about how much beyond Ukraine Russia will extend the repression, and whether or not I know that Irakli and other people have already been talking about the creation of a zone of peace through the South Caucasus and other areas such as Armenia, Georgia, I don't know, South Ossetia, I don't know where all. But if a whole region could be created as a neutral zone, and I don't know whether you want to equate neutrality with the notion of a zone of peace, or if you want to distinguish between the two concepts, but it is such an ambitious project, even realistic to hope for.
So when Chris was talking about the position of Russia, that Russia also has some excuse. Russia don't want to be NATO very close to their borders, but we need to remember that when these states signed in 1992 Belovezhskaya Pusha, do you remember when they announced destroy of Soviet Union? And in these declarations, they signed that every country has its own politics, its own motivation, its own will, so they can decide it to join NATO or not to join NATO. The main is that none of the big country don't use force. So United States or some other countries, they don't force me, Georgia, to become a member of NATO. If my population, 78% of my population, in free social surveys says that we see our future with NATO, there is no other way for Russia to force us. The same with Ukraine, because Ukraine is a sovereign country and Ukraine can decide how to do, to be with NATO or not to be with NATO. So it's, and what is very interesting is that for Putin, NATO is not dangerous. For Putin, the main is to rebuild new Soviet Union. with the same territory when it was before, because you know that Putin said that the most tragedy of the 20th century was destroy of Soviet Union. For Putin, it was tragedy. For us, it was very happy days when we are have our sovereign country. So I cannot make some justification maybe for Russia when they are talking about their security, because there is none of the case when NATO occupy or make some threat to other country. But with Georgia, we have in 2008 the main goal, motivation from Russia to enter Georgia, occupy Georgia, was why you want to be with NATO. So this means that none of the justification may be for Russia. And what is our peace zone? When I very attentively read Mitchell's and when we are talking about the peace zone in El Salvador or Philippines or other, it's like managed by local community. When we are talking about huge country or even big region as South Caucasus, there must be some agreement between the big power country. Without this, we cannot even talk about neutrality and about peace zone. I understand that maybe it's good to have some buffer country between Russia and Europe. But in this sense, if we declare, maybe Georgia declare neutrality, that we are not sure how the reaction will be from Russia. And we are not sure who can defend us. Because 2008, the situation shows that there was, of course, some reaction from United States, from other European countries, but more or less Russia did what he wanted to do. Because he takes these 20% of our territory, occupies this territory. So when we are talking about peace zone, we need to distinguish what kind of peace zone. We already have, that in Ergneti, if you hear, Ergneti is placed in the middle way between Tbilisi and South Ossetia. And till 2005, we have Ergneti market. And people from South Ossetia, from Russia, from Georgia, from Armenia, from Azerbaijan, they meet each other here and trade. And it was quite open, and Georgian money was circulate, and other money also was circulate. But it was like source of smuggling, and our former government, national movement government, closed this Ergneti market. And I think it was big mistake, because if you take what is better to have some income in our budget, or to have a place where people can make some good friendship relationship, trade relationship, it's much more better to have such place. And Irakli's idea and our people's idea was also to make such peace zone near the Red Bridge, where is three countries point, where three countries border is this Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. I say that nowadays, if not Ukrainian crisis, nowadays was better situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan. We understand that after this last Karabakh event, Armenia, Azerbaijan, they are a little more open to have some dialogue with each other. And for Georgia, it's natural place, independent, like to make that intermediate, make that negotiator or mediator between the Armenian and Azerbaijan. We always have such a role in our region. So nowadays, I don't know how this Ukrainian crisis will be ended, but we can think how to make South Caucasus peace in South Caucasus more like the beneficial for all big countries. These people are this Russia, Turkey, United States, even China, because China's interest also may be, because it is crossroad, this Caucasus, and from China also to have the way to Europe, it's also important. So I think that we need to work in this direction to make some justification, to make some motivation, how it may be beneficial for this big country. And that's why I think we need to publish a lot of article or made some direct contact with top leaders or this like influential people who are leaders of thoughts, maybe the journalist or other people, and to push this idea to have South Caucasus as a peaceful zone and how beneficial it may be for big countries.
Could I ask you though, if you've named a whole bunch of countries that aren't in the South Caucasus, China and Turkey. Turkey's close, but China's certainly not.
Yes, but
what countries would be in the zone of peace in your vision?
Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia.
Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia.
South Caucasus. Yeah.
Okay.
For nowadays, I think it cannot be tomorrow, but it makes sense to talk about this, because in feature of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, it's to make more strong unit in this area, because if you can form this strong unit, this region will be much it will be not easy to touch this region. That's why I think that we need to work in this direction. And first of all, we need to make, insight cohesiveness among these three countries. And after this, also to work outside of our country and justify for Turkey, Russia, Europe, and China that this part of land, these territories, these three countries together, peace in these three countries, peace in this territory will be beneficial for them.
Okay, I think we would all agree it'd be beneficial for you, but you
for us, of course, first of all, for us.
You didn't mention Ukraine as part of it, and that's interesting. Why not? I would think that from the point of view of Russia, getting Ukraine to be a neutral country might actually have some traction. If they, of course, too late to start it right now, because they've already burned some bridges. But if somebody had offered to make Ukraine into a neutral country a year ago, maybe it would have been attractive to Russia and more interesting to Russia than what you're proposing for the South Caucasus as a zone of peace. Russia isn't threatened by, or doesn't feel too threatened by the countries you've named so far as I know, and so I don't think they would care that much. Do you?
Ukrainian decision, it's Ukrainian people's decision, because Ukraine is a sovereign country and they can decide be neutral or be independent or will member of NATO. But after this event, what happened now, as all people mentioned, Russia is not trustful partner.
Of course.
That's why it's very difficult to convince Ukrainian people that be neutral means that you will be saved from Russia. This is the main. If we have another country instead of Russia's place, each maybe, but Russia not now. Frankly speaking, historically. If you see historically, Russia always is engaged in such event and things. When some people in Council of Europe, I remember I was member of Parliament and was member of Council of Delegation, Georgian delegation. When they was talking about first time that they say no to Russia delegation, and some of people from Council of Europe, they want to be Russia in Council of Europe. Some of them not, and I say that Russia is very specific country. Maybe other countries are also like this, but you cannot talk with Russia. Russia respect only power. If Russia see that there is some unit, some country, it's build economic power or military power, they begin talk when the other country is much more stronger. If Russia realize that the other side is not as a little much more stronger than Russia is, he never listens. This country never listens any negotiation. And we have 300 years relationship with Russia. Unfortunately, East European, West European, old European, after in Hitler's period, they were together with Soviet Union. And after this, they have not this direct contact with Soviet Union and with Russia. And that's why they think about Russia better than Russia is really. I don't know, maybe I'm psychologist by my education, and maybe there is some general mentality, or I don't know why, but historically, always we are talking, we were sometimes we were joking that in Soviet Union, when some people from Russia appear in some African country, like tourist or visiting or delegation, you can be sure that after some time, some serious things will be beginning in this country. And it's maybe my personal opinion, but I think that we need to talk with Russia in more strong words, strongly.
I would wonder whether Chris Mitchell agrees with you. I don't think everything he said is quite consistent with what you're saying.
Maybe it's my personal view and my experience to have a more close relationship with Russia.
Well, I don't know whether anybody else has heard this saying, but it's fairly well known on this side of the Atlantic. And it's a saying about Mexico, it goes, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the USA. And maybe we could sort of twist it round and say, poor countries of the Caucasus, so far from God, so close to the Russians. It seems to me that I agree with most of what Gugulis has said. There's this long history of Russian expansion into the Black Sea area, towards the Mediterranean, towards the east, and that's a terribly difficult history to overcome, to change, to do different things about it. My reason for talking about the Ukraine as a zone of peace, though I'm equally interested in some of Irakli's ideas about the countries of the Caucasus as some kind of a zone of peace. And the other thing we need to think about is when we're talking about a zone of peace, specifically, we need to be clear about what kind of a zone of peace it is, what's its characteristics, is it armed, is it neutral, what does neutrality mean, etc., etc. But my point is that Gugul is quite right. They all signed the agreement that they all became sovereign, independent countries that could notionally please themselves, whether they joined NATO, whether they played football in the World Cup, whatever, that's true. But because of where they are, right next to Russia, actually right in between Turkey and Russia, occasionally I think you have to sort of think about, do we want to always do exactly what we want to do, or do we have to take some notice of what we do affecting our neighbors? And unfortunately, our neighbor is just this big bear. And so we have to take into consideration what our effect will have on that bear. So maybe we stop thinking about being completely free because we're not in a place to be free. We can't be a Switzerland. We can't be a France. But maybe we could be an Austria. Maybe we will give up a certain amount of complete freedom because of where we are. I mean, the parallel to me is at the moment, as all of you, I'm sure, have read, there is a huge debate in the United States about whether being a free citizen of the United States allows you to do almost anything, including refusing to wear a mask in order to prevent the spread of COVID. And there are a lot of people who say any attempt to make me wear a mask is an infringement of my freedom. And indeed it is.
No, because it is damage for other people. If
Right,
it only
exactly.
for you, it's okay.
Yeah,
But when this damage my health, you are not free.
exactly. So there have to be sort of limitations somewhere. And I think that's the same with countries, with nations. So, you know, my question is for my Ukrainian friends, and also, of course, from people who come from the three countries in the Caucasus, what's the equivalent of deciding that you need to wear a mask in political terms? But Irakli, you know, you talked an awful lot about the idea of a zone of peace in the South Caucasus. I mean, I know you and Guguli have been working on this with Susan for a long, long time. You must have thought through some of the difficulties of this, and you know, leaving aside the terrible situation we're in at the moment, it's not going to be an easy thing to bring off. I mean, you must have thought about that. So, could you tell us something about what you've thought and what you and Guguli have considered?
Yes. When we started doing this, of course, Chris and Dennis Sandoli went to Caucasus and first introduced this idea the beginning of the 90s. I think it was with Murad Muradian when you went there to the Karabakh region and to the Armenia and Azerbaijan and first introduced this idea. And the second attempt was made in 1997 by Johan Galtung, when he came to Tbilisi, and then he went to Yerevan, and he went to Baku. And Johan Galtung, when we brought him, and he introduced the idea of the peace zone, which Guguli was just talking about, and Guguli and I were together at George Mason University. We were listening to Chris's and our dear professor's ideas about the peace zones. So Galtung, who was also in the George Mason in 96, and he started to talk about the Caucasian peace zones in 96 when he met with the ambassadors of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. He said, this is realistic. And then he proposes the peace zone in 1997 at the Red Bridge area. Red Bridge area is an area in the southeast of Georgia, which is having the borders at the same time with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now, this idea went forward. Some people started to work on this, and there was this big NGO, and a lot of money was spent on that by different NGOs, including the International Alert, the Canadian government, the Norwegian government, and other governments put the money into NGO activities, so-called peace activists. Now, I have to tell you the truth. Right now, I mean, this had its pluses and its minuses. In the year of 2000, Ambassador John McDonald, our friend and esteemed colleague who just and teacher and mentor who just passed away about three years ago, he was very active also in promoting peace zones in South Caucasus. He came first time to talk about it in the year 2000. Then, when the Rose Revolution happened, just after the Rose Revolution, we started the active process of promoting peace zones. And Prime Minister Zurab Zhvania was beside us. We actually had the first meeting arranged in Trabzon, Turkey, to get together economic communities of Abkhaz and Georgian and South Ossetians and get together, starting an economic process, as Guguli mentioned right now, very rightfully so, around the Erganeti basically it was a illegal market exchange place at the so-called border. There is no border there, but actually at the Erganeti place. So this idea was actively circulating within the Georgian government. We had the support of Prime Minister. Prime Minister went along with us, but he was killed in the beginning of 2005. We don't know who murdered him. Some people say it was a Russian military industrial complex because they wanted to sell lots of arms and he didn't sign the deal of $1.5 billion of selling the AK-47 and other parts of Russian arms through Tbilisi. And Tbilisi actually was used during Saakashvili time, actually, during the war for the arms sales. During the war, they sold about $2 billion. In 5 days, they sold $2 billion worth of SS-20. So military industrial complex was behind those politicians and is behind those politicians who are blocking the peace decision. In Georgia, it was like that. So what we saw after 2005, after the Prime Minister, Zvania, who was supporting this process, was killed, then we saw, most of us got arrested. I had to leave Georgia again and come to the United States, where I saw my dear Chris and our friends at George Mason again. And then I worked at Cornell and in lots of other places before I came back to Georgia into 2012. Then we started again. I met with the Prime Minister again, the new Prime Minister, of course, Bizina Ivanishvili, who was there in January of 2012. And I said, look, Prime Minister, do you want a peace zone? This is the only solution for this country. If you want to bring this country out of mess, you, a billionaire, he was the richest man in Georgia, $5 billion that he still has. I mean, he resigned after that. And some people call him informal leader of Georgia. He said, yes, I will go for it. Actually, we have invited John McDonnell, who at the age of 92 came here and gave big lectures on the peace zones. But the Security Service of Georgia, on the orders of military industrial complex, blocked this again. And then I had a meeting with the Prime Minister. He said, where was your John McDonnell? I said, he was here for 10 days. He was blocked by security services who were paid by the military factory. And, all of this stuff is really, really, in some ways ridiculous. But right now, switching from the activist theme, of course, all the activists in Tbilisi right now are in the streets. There's a million of them. But what they are demanding the end of Russian imperialism. They're saying, kill Putin, peace activists. Why? Because Putin is seen right now, is bombing the cities. What we see on the TV, Georgian TV or any other TV you watch, is that Putin is killing children right now with the bombs from the planes. So lots of activist work right now has turned into anti-Russian, which I understand. I can understand it because the images are horrible. And as Guguli said, the Georgians saw it in Gori, actually. Half of Gori was destroyed by Georgian bombs, and the children were killed by Putin's hands. He looks like Stalin. He just doesn't have a mustache, but he's becoming Stalin. But moving from that, unfortunately, the activism right now is not working the way it should work because of the lots of things that politicians on behalf of military industrial complex. In Georgia, we had a very, very, very concrete examples how military industrial complex blocked the peace zones, which, Chris and Dennis and Landon Hancock and our esteemed colleagues have created the handbooks. And the whole idea was, which both prime ministers backed, was that to declare whole South Caucasus as a peace zone. This could be applied to Ukraine as well. And peace zone as a positive term as opposed to neutrality. Neutrality is not a good term for me because this implies someone who is like an impotent person. Neutrality today for majority of people means like this guy is, this is an impotent guy and, they can't do anything. And then of course the Swiss example, as Chris said, we cannot be a Switzerland where everyone is armed at the same time. And they have all these banks, huge banks and financial capital is controlling it, which is, by the way, hand in hand with the military.
Irakli, can I interrupt and ask what the real difference is? I mean, you have connotations that offend you. You feel neutrality means powerlessness, but substantively, in terms of international law,
I'm not getting offended.
what would be the difference between neutrality and a zone of peace in terms of what actual policy or legal treaty differences would there be?
Right. Well, in terms of legal treaties, I will say that this is a difference between negative peace and positive peace. Peace zone is a positive peace term. Neutrality for me is a negative peace, which is the absence of war, and then by some money, by some ways, is a negative term. In some ways, it's basically rejecting something, but really not bringing a positiveness to it. Now, what is very good in a concept of the peace zone, so right now I'm doing with Dr. Irakli Kakabadze, I'm doing my dissertation on this, how the psychological mindset of politicians and also decision makers, how can we reach the mindset of politicians? Because I have seen firsthand, twice actually, how we failed to convince them. And one of them we didn't fail to convince. One of them was killed because the other ones were having a different mindset. And they decided this guy was really wanted to make a peace zone and he gets to be eliminated. And then they started to sell arms for billions of dollars through Georgia. Yes. So how it happens is that the positiveness of that comes through the economic exchange, of course, the cultural exchange, and the creativity exchange. Of course, that is the essence of a peace zone, basically, as opposed to just neutrality and being a banking, basically a bank for different thugs from around the world.
Okay, I still want an answer to my question, and I'm going to turn to Chris for an answer because you've given me your what means to you, but I want to hear what the legal difference is. What actually would be the obligations taken by a state if it declared itself neutral, as opposed to whatever it would take to create a zone of peace? What are the actual substantive international legal obligations that differ?
Well, insofar as I understand the conception of neutrality, there's a fairly well laid out set of rights and obligations if you declare yourself neutral. I'm not at all sure what they are, but I'm not a lawyer. But I do recall that many years ago, my own professor, was very interested in what a concept that he called neutralism, active neutralism. So if you want an example of active neutralism, think not of Switzerland, but think of Sweden or Uruguay. There are small countries that are extremely active in peace building activities, in contributing to peacekeeping forces, in being go-betweens and honest brokers when conflicts arise. It's a very, very active role in the international system that can be actually carried out to some degree by countries that have declared themselves to be not necessarily a peace zone, but are acting as peacemakers. The other thing, of course, is the great thing about a peace zone is that it can involve, being free of certain kinds of weapons. There are peace zones throughout the world. Latin America is actually one of them, believe it or not. They've all agreed not to adopt a policy of attempting to get nuclear weapons. So there are nuclear-free zones. Okay. There are countries that have joined together in some kind of an economic union. Interestingly enough, and this is one of the things that occurred to me when Irakli was reminding me about the fortunes or misfortunes of peace zones in the Caucasus. There are zones of cooperation which cut across international borders, and local authorities on either side of the international border actually involve themselves in economic activities, planning, etc., etc. For example, there's one which embraces local authorities in northern Italy, in southern Switzerland, and I think in France. The Italian title is Alto Adige. It's a cross-border economic cooperation arrangement by local authorities, which is permitted but independent of national governments. So, if you're looking at different kinds of peace zones, and again, this is something that Irakli and Guguli have both mentioned in terms of the Caucasus, they can be of any size, they can be economic, they can be political, they can be arms-free. And in fact, was it Guguli who I think it may have been you, said, well, all right, how do you get to these peace zones? One of the things that I think that Irakli and Guguli were talking about was setting up a peace zone in, I'm not sure whether it was in Georgia or whether it was actually in Armenia, as a model. So that one of if you're asking, well, what can we do in order to encourage people to think about peace zones, is try to establish one locally as a model, and see how easy or how difficult, and believe me, it's very difficult to run a local peace community.
I like that.
Maybe straddles the border. Maybe within one country or maybe within two countries, to see how it works, to use it as a model.
It's the first thing that we've come up with that has some possibilities so far today. Mostly we've been stumped. I thank you very much, Chris. And I'm aware that Lynn has been sitting patiently with a question or a comment, and we don't have much time, but Lynn, it's your time.
Thank you. Well, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we are saying common security is got to be the framework for building peace, and that the reliance on force, NATO's threats of force, Russia's threats of force, and actual use of force now are just showing that we have not been negotiating, we have not been working towards peace building in the region. And we have to address, I think, the underlying economic interest. I was glad that it was brought up about the sales of arms. Iraq, you talked about that, and how there's these forces that are lined up against peace building. And so we have to build the positive direction forward. And, right now we need to be working on the climate crisis globally. That is the thing which threatens the future for everyone, threatens food production, threatens refugees in the millions and even billions. Unless we have to actually be working cooperatively to resolve these fundamental issues of our future. So somehow we have to get back on the track of finding common interests and getting away from the threat, the program that we're in. And here in Canada, we're trying to call on our government not to feed that military side of this conflict by sending weapons, by just saber rattling in so many ways as part of NATO and also in Canada, under the influence of a Ukrainian-Canadian lobby, certainly, but there's no excuse for not actively peace building and promoting. So we will be issuing a statement today. We do already have a statement on Ukraine and what we're calling on the Canadian government to do. And we need to build the lobby for peace and for shifting the framework. And I think we need to name those economic interests that are driving this particular aggression that we're seeing right now. And I don't think we talk about it enough, because peace seems like an airy-fairy concept to people. But if we say this is about finding win-win solutions to the needs that these populations have, including the need for some sense of autonomy and a voice in what happens in your own country. And we really need to build up the framework for negotiations. So I'll just say that and see if there's any responses to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I and Irakli, we are now thinking about the model, of course, and we are thinking about psychological structure of how to change our approach towards the peace. It's, it's maybe like this, that as much as people has such kind of mentality, this is much more better to push some ideas. And we have very interesting psychologist, Uznadze, and Uznadze used the word of attitude. And attitude, which means that if person has some need, and this need appropriate situation, these two factors made specific state of personality, and person will do the concrete action. This is, and we want to show that this peace zone may be different in different countries, because need and situation may be differs from a different country. And I think this will be one of the theoretical justification. How can change this mentality of people toward the people peace?
Mm-hmm.
You will see, and we'll yeah.
And
I agree with Guguli, actually. And there was an example where we brought together the Georgians, the Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Abkhaz Ossetians, and Turkish people in Yerevan for an environmental project, which was called Enemy of the People, built after the Ibsen's Enemy of the People, about the Black Sea contamination. And there, the mindset, actually, the attitude that Guguli was talking, turned out so positive. That was in 2017. And our friend Arsen Kharatian, a great Arsen Kharatian from George Mason, also was there, one of the guys who organized that. It worked so well. But again and again and again, next year, this project was ruined by the military-industrial complex people who said that this is bad for Georgian security.
So you need to mobilize more people against such complex mentality. To change mentality is the main. It needs time, step by step, but to change mentality is principle.
Well, we all agree that everybody's mentality could stand some improvement, and we've
of course
used up our time. But I found it very enlightening, and I'm still out there promoting Austria as a good starting point, which I think is not. We're beyond that right now, but at any rate, you've given me food for thought, and everybody else some excellent ingredients for the next stage of our struggle. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating, and all good wishes to everybody.
It was great to see you again.
Thank you very much. Irakli Kakabadze, take care.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, and sometimes more. This is episode 416. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get to the website, look around, because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular show that you want to watch, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.